Hi everyone, my name is Josh Gallagher. Welcome to this week's edition of Loop Live. And I'm going to talk about today e-commerce, which is obviously one of my favorite topics to talk about. You're going to hear a little bit from me today and a little bit from a co-presenter. And I think broadly what we're going to talk about, and I was kind of thinking about the last session we had, and if you weren't here, the last session we had on Loop Live was around addressable creative and how being able to be using technology and understanding people from a creative perspective can work really well. One of the things that I was thinking about when we were thinking about addressable creative in today is that sometimes marketing feels like a series of trade-offs. And with addressable creative, sometimes that trade-off is personalization or scale. And I think one of the things that we spoke about last week, which was really interesting, is that it doesn't need to be a trade-off. We can still have addressable creative without compromising scale. And I think sometimes there's a trade-off in e-commerce. There's a trade-off between how much we can target people and how much people are searching for products and the limitations that marketplaces put on the type of creative work that we can do and the creativity itself. And that's why today, after a short presentation, I'm going to talk to Neha, which I'll introduce now, around the role that creativity should be playing within creative. So a quick introduction from Neha, and then I'll get stuck into the presentation.
Thank you for having me, Josh. Hi everyone, I'm Neha Tejuja. I work at Wunderman Thompson. I'm practically furniture there, but I also wear two other hats, one as a strategist and the other as in a newly minted e-commerce lead role. Happy to be here.
Thank you. I think we're seeing the emergence of strategists become e-com experts because I think as we, and I'll get into the presentation and I'll stop talking too much at the moment. I think as we're seeing that we need to think more about being creative within e-commerce platforms, as we need to think broadly about shopper experiences strategically and not just executionally, we're definitely seeing the emerging of people like yourself and myself who from strategy backgrounds are now having to think about consumers and the way that they're using products in a much more thoughtful way than perhaps we had in the past. And it's a good segue, I suppose, to my presentation is around tipping points and why we need to start thinking about some of these shopper tipping points and why now more than ever shopping is much more important and thinking about shoppers is important and thinking about shoppers' lives is more important than it ever has been. And I'm going to share some perspective today around some things that I've noticed over the past 10 months that have been real tipping points in shopping here to stay. And e-commerce here to stay. I mentioned this a few times, and I suppose in every presentation I do, I speak about 10 years of progress in just 10 months. But the way that we speak about that a lot of the time is just in the acceleration of habits. So of course, people were already buying things online in the past. This isn't something totally new. But what we've seen, and this is some Amazon retail e-commerce sales data, is that we saw a really big change in habits or an acceleration in people buying on platforms. So from 2019 to 2020, you can see that huge growth moment that we've had, and we're predicting even not as rapid rate of growth, but definitely growth within e-commerce sales using e-commerce data from the US. But this isn't a story that is uncommon around the world. But there were definitely those habits that were accelerated. So some of the habits that we're talking about, or the output of some of those habits, what we'll see in a few years is that 25% of all retail sales will be online. And that's really big for me and for some of the brands that we work with that are consumer packaged goods brands, which have always relied on a physical relationship. And 25% as a number for me is a really big tipping point. I think when e-commerce first started out, we would say, oh, just treat it like another store opening. Treat it like another distribution point that it's happening. And that's when e-commerce was really small. It kind of converted into conversations around it's another market within a country, or it's another country that's opening. But a brand that has 25% of retail sales online, that's almost like another continent that you need to consider, or another big operating unit of your business. And that's why it's now a tipping point for all clients across the world. And there's scale across 25% for some categories, bigger and smaller. But regardless of that, it's more than just opening up another shop front. It's a huge part of our clients' business. One of the other things that's a big tipping point is in the way that people research and the way that people enter into brands. Now we know that well over 63% of customers visit a retailer site before they actually go into a physical store. And that's a really big change for a lot of brands. It's a big change for brands that we work with, like an Adidas, who saw this happen over the last 10 months. A brand that previously you wanted to go into the store to try on a pair of shoes or some new running kit or some football boots, that's changed in a really big way. People are more willing to now go online, check prices, see running shoes before they even try them on their feet. And I think for a physical retailer and someone who has products that are used in a really physical way, that's a big change in the way that we think about shopping and the way that we think about that retail experience. And one of the big, I suppose, lagging indicators for me is where advertisers put money. Sometimes we see media consumption and changes in media consumption coming well before the investment in different areas or different channels from a media perspective. But the one thing that we can see from data from Google is that within total search investment, now 61 of that search investment actually goes into shopping. So yes, Google as a platform is used for the full funnel. It's used for branding. It's used for conversion. But a lot of it is now going into really direct response shopping products. Some of those shopping products are changing in a big way and becoming much more creative in the way that we are able to shop through things like Google search with product imagery, or even in the future be able to shop directly on ads on YouTube. But that's a real change in intent for me, and a change in habit that reflects how people are searching, because search is sometimes a really good map of human intent for products and the way that they buy things. So that's what I mean by habit changes. So we've seen that real acceleration of things that were already happening that are happening now at a greater rate. But the big thing that has changed for me, and the reason why we're having this conversation today, is that e-commerce and shopping is shaped by behavior, and it is being reshaped by the changes of behavior that people are having in their lives. And I've got a couple of things that I've noticed, and I'm sure that there's a whole heap more things out there around different changes in behavior. But what we've seen here, and again, this is some US data, but I'm sure that it happens in the rest of the world, is that before lockdown, it was predominantly people were searching for products on Google or Amazon, and there was a small amount of other searches happening by people. You can see that the shape of searching during lockdown changed in a dramatic way. A much smaller portion of Google and Amazon searches, two of the biggest companies in the world, and that other has increased. And what is that other portion? Now, that other is searching on retailer platforms, grocery retailer platforms, like in the UK, it might be Tesco or Carrefour in France. It could be a Kroger in the US, or it could be down into Australia, a Coles or Woolworths online. So there's those big changes that are happening in the way that people are searching and buying online. And that's a behavior change. People aren't going physically into grocery stores. They're now buying things online. The shape of the Amazon business is changing as well. But it's also things like delivery. People now are getting their food delivered to their home. The infrastructure is there for people to get food delivered, and that is changing the way that we search for meals online. And that's been one of the bigger behavior changes. And that's something that's been happening in a lot of markets, but is happening more and more. It's really pronounced in markets like Japan and Korea. So what we see as a big behavior change in these markets, which has been happening over some time, but now there's the e-commerce infrastructure to be able to deliver upon that, is that a quarter of Japan, or the households in Japan, are actually single occupants. And from eating alone and cooking alone, that's changed the way that people are consuming those types of products, and it's changed the e-commerce landscape. So this is a big behavior change that means for a lot of brands, their method of distribution needs to change. And that's really important from an e-commerce perspective. The second thing that I'm going to talk about that's a really interesting behavior change for me, and we'll see how it works across the rest of the world, but this is some data from China around live stream viewing. And we know how popular live streams are in China. But what we're seeing is that the peak of viewing behavior in the evening, which is the peak time, is that more people are now watching live streams than they are watching linear TV or TV that isn't piped through a digital method or is an OTT platform. So you've got more people viewing people talking about products in an entertaining way than they are watching regular TV programs. And that's really interesting just from a shopping perspective as well. But as you dig deeper into the behavior in China, what we've seen through some research that the Mediacom team in China have put together is that the late night economy is really affecting this. People are staying up later. People are doing things much later in the evening, including buying products, but also consuming food to the delivery point that I made before. And then finally, a really interesting thing around behavior change is how important brands are. And what we're seeing is that a lot of people that buy online have really strong brand preference. So 48% of online buyers know the brand or have a very strong preference for that brand before they go into actually buying a product. And I think that that's a really big change, because that's a lot bigger than the brand preference that people have when they go into a physical store. And the dynamics of buying in a physical store, especially for things like grocery, are much different than they are when people go online. And the way that we discover products and the way that we search for products online is changed. So I think that the way that brands have to build themselves, not in a transactional way, but overall from a brand perspective, doesn't need a rethink, but needs emphasis on the way that they're doing that. And I think that that's a really good way to start to bring in a bit more of a conversation around brands and creativity, because I think commerce has never been so obsessed with people and what their lives are like. And I think from a strategic perspective and from a marketing perspective, that's really interesting. So that's something that I'd really like to share some thoughts on, discuss with Neha a little bit as well, to see what her thoughts are on there. And I'd invite people to bring up any comments in the chat as well, as we go through, to get your thoughts on that. So I'm going to start with my first question. Hi Neha, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good. So we've seen the consumers' lives are changing. I've given a couple of examples around how I think that they're changing, and with some data points. I'm sure there's many more. How do you think that that's affecting creativity, but also the way that creative agencies are acting and the way that creative agencies build brand experiences?
Right. I think the way we now think of the experience, we sort of think of it end to end. As you mentioned, right, consumers are discovering more and more products online, even on marketplaces. 63%, that was sort of nearly 63% was the figure. And as marketers, we've always been very good at designing for, creating awareness, for instance. But now we sort of need to see it all the way through to the sale. And the great news is that there are multiple formats now that enable this, right? So these formats have increased. So retail channels are social channels sort of link through to e-commerce. And even as, consumer behavior may change, we can still identify and work with what makes them tick. And that's that's the difference sort of that we bring in. And this is an exciting sort of opportunity for us to design for this. So actually, I'm gonna talk about an example that we did recently. Some of the work that we did for Kellogg's in Philippines. So it was backed by a really strong consumer attention, which was Philippines has actually been one of the longest suffering lockdowns in the world. So even as kids are continuing their homeschooling and parents are juggling work, they're running out of ideas to keep their kids occupied, and or even for sort of fun family activities. So we worked thanks, collaboratively with Kellogg's. We created a magic show for their brand Choco's Magic. It was a live magic show which extended, sort of the breakfast joy that you bring even beyond. Um, it was linked through to discounts on the marketplace. But I think what was even more heartening was that there were plenty of happy kids. We had a record level of views and reactions on the platform. And this kind of shows you, as long as you understand what makes consumers tick, you can design for that experience. But I also think there are other factors that we need to start considering now, right? Consumers are no longer buying a product just for the quality alone. There are other hardworking elements that we do need to focus on. So things like, availability, value, convenience in delivery and returns. So we need to ensure we design for these things as well and not disregard those. It's very easy for us to just design for the experience and the awareness and forget all of this. But it's important as we move into commerce to look at that as well.
I think it's an interesting point, because I think commerce, when it first started out and when it first started scaling, everyone was it's just about price and convenience. And we kind of forgot about the consumer in that, because we just assumed that everyone wanted cheap stuff and they wanted it quite quickly. So I think that's really interesting. And I'm sure that you're seeing it a lot around the consumer coming back in to what we're doing, which for me, I kind of felt like was lost a lot when we started thinking about e-commerce in that perspective.
True.
Yeah. Easy answer to that one. Yes, agree.
Sorry. What I mean to say is, I think at one point we did design for throw discounts at them and they'll come, but it's not enough, right? There is so much more that goes into that commerce experience.
Yeah.
So for instance, even how you design for the shelf, and we can come to that a little later maybe, but even that's critical.
I mean, I think that's a good jump off point, is that those physical and online experiences are really complementary, because we do say it's not 100% of people just go online. People are mixing between the two. They do have an omni-channel experience. They're complementary, but I don't think that they're the same, or the opportunities aren't the same always. So how do we kind of rethink that digital shelf experience now that we have a bit more scale behind online buying as well?
Right. We do have that scale, and that digital shelf may seem almost unlimited, but I think we still have to be extremely strategic about it, right? It's still getting many things to work together, and it's not just about the placement. So the shelf is a very key touch point in discovery for us. And so, for instance, another brand that we're working on, it's a confectionery brand, and it uses sort of their best-selling products or their best-selling brand to draw people into the shop and shop that they have, and then lead to some of the others. And that's sort of critical in designing for that shelf. You have to understand how the various, just like a physical shelf, how the various elements work together and how you can sort of draw adjacencies, if you will. So it's like a hero halo, but for marketplaces. And even when you're thinking of, even though it's an unlimited space, the space above the fold is pretty much the most that your consumers will see. So how do you use that strategically and be able to push, say, discounts or promos on the brands that aren't as strong, or use, as I said, product adjacencies, bundling to optimize for that sort of shelf space, right? And I think one of the things that we forget, and this is my personal experience as well when shopping online, is how much information can you provide on that hero image. It may seem so tactical, but it's so important that everything that I need to know, the size, what the fragrance, for instance, what it's good for on that hero image is important. And I think alongside, we probably also need to think about how this is going to show up in search, the responsiveness of the brands, the ratings and reviews. And because consumers are relying more and more on this, right? So even as we design for conversion, we need to think through that whole journey. And I'm actually going to put you back in the hot seat on this, Josh. So you sort of touched on this in your presentation, right? So how do you see this playing out, especially as you design for search and visibility? And what has been your experience in it?
I think search is a really interesting one, because I think the way that we are going to need to design search is totally changed. Before we had one platform, so in theory we could just have a funnel that we had search on that would kind of work for any category, right? I think that's changed in a big way, and I think it's category dependent. So if I think you mentioned bundling of products together and adjacencies, I think that's really relevant from a searching perspective for a grocery product, because they don't go on and just buy one thing, right? You don't just go on and buy shampoo and then check out, right? You buy it with other things. So we need to think about the experience that they're having as a shopper as a whole, and how they might be buying things together. But that's for things that probably aren't a complex searching experience. You're going to buy shampoo, you just type in the type of shampoo that you want and you buy it, but you might buy it with some complementary products. I think once it gets to more complex decisions, so maybe electronics, the complexity around there, I think, happens less in bundling and less in adjacencies, but more in multiple platforms now. So it's not like you're just going through Google and then you're going to buy straight away, maybe on a .com. You might be researching somewhere else. Right, so I've seen it in electronics categories in different markets where people will search on the marketplace. So they might search on Amazon, but then they'll buy somewhere else, right? And I think that happens for different products. So understanding how the products work and how they're researched versus how they're bought, now that we're not just going through the lens of Google, but we're going through the lens of multiple different platforms and multiple different choices of platforms, I think that changes what we do. So an understanding of portfolio, an understanding of assortment strategies within products becomes quite important. And I think for me, that's the really interesting thing around e-commerce, because it's not just a media play and it's not just a creative play, but we need to think about how those two things work together.
That's a good point. And I think it kind of brings up the need for being able to have some visibility and ownership of the data as well. So what you're basically speaking of, if I go and compare prices on Amazon and then potentially buy off, say, Lazada for a complex product, as a marketer, you probably don't have visibility of it. And that's where the need for being able to bring your data together becomes critical.
Yeah, and it's just a really good understanding of it, because I'm conscious when I talk to brands that when we start to then talk about the margin of their products, they're often different on different platforms, right? You're going to sell something with a higher margin on your own platform than you are when you're working with a third party. So you might not even want people to buy on a third party platform. You might be happy for them to research there, but you actually don't want them to buy there in many cases, as long as you have supply chain and all of those kinds of things worked out.
Correct.
So I'm going to lead into the next question, because we've spoken a little bit around, or I spoke a little bit around more and more retail channels, more and more formats that are there. I think I read a stat, and I'm using this a little bit, and I'm making it up, and I'm making it bigger as I go along. But I think in the US, if you're looking for shoes or if you're looking for trainers, there's around 600 different platforms that you can go on and buy a pair of trainers. And they all offer very different experiences, different prices, all of those kinds of things. So what do you think that you see the benefit of more platforms? Is it those different experiences that you can have on platforms? Is it that you can start to see new formats coming out like live commerce or those kinds of things? Or is it, you mentioned data, is it the ability to capture and then use data in a more meaningful way, or both?
So the new formats, the new experiences are a big plus, right? It allows us to engage with consumers in what was typically, say, a transactional environment. And it allows them to also engage in new ways, with gamification, crowdsourcing discounts, for instance, will tell you which of your products are doing well. That is a data point in itself. And it also sort of allows consumers to have an instant channel to seek answers, because if there's any friction in that buying process, they'll probably exit. And in social environments as well, as we're looking at it, it allows for so much more. We can enable discovery in so many interesting ways, through various formats, through experiences, through collaborations, influencers. We can connect to messaging if consumers have questions, and perhaps even learn more about the consumers along the way, not just answer their questions, but also sort of try and progressively almost profile them, again, enabling for more data collection in there. And even then sell through these channels, right? And eventually, as we connect through these various social formats, and we connect them onto a D2C platform for brands that actually who have those, or at least can create a light version to be able to sell, say, of social commerce. We can piece more information together about these consumers. So that's where it's critical to use those experiences to not just sell, but understand your consumers better, to be able to then create that better segmentation and better almost one-to-one marketing, if you may.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. And I'm going to reference a question that has been asked by Kurt that's come through the comments. And Kurt's asked, for small retail businesses, particularly new ones who only operate online, what do they need to do in order to compete with the giants like Amazon, eBay, so that they get sales? So for me, it's about experience, because I think to the last question that I'm going to ask, one of my frustrations that I see on marketplaces is that whether you're selling a $100 product or a $100,000 product, the experience is actually very similar. In a lot of cases, you have exactly the same format, exactly the same way that people are selling online. So I think my question to you is I suppose back to the original purpose of this is how do you think experiences need to change? Do you think creativity in e-commerce is being challenged, or do you think it's a really big opportunity for us?
I do think this is largely true. You can still actually create standout storefronts, standout experiences. So if you look at some of the SK2, and if you see what SK2 is doing on Lazada, they have a flagship store on Lazmall. They have the ability to you can receive personalized beauty advice, virtual sort of skincare consultation through the in-app chat function on Lazada. And when it first launched, consumers could also receive their products in a Lazmall exclusive gift box, which contain other delighters. And also don't forget that at the end of the day, even as you design on marketplaces and there's limited view that you have of the data and the availability there, we still own the product and the experience that's delivered to the consumer when they do get that product in hand, right? So we can design for it, because the experience doesn't stop only at the online store. With that product, you can create opportunities that allows for better consumer experiences, that allows them to engage with you, come back, digitally as well, or say through subscriptions. I know subscriptions haven't taken off as well in, say, Asia, but that truly is the one place which we own end to end, and we can ensure we deliver a great experience as well, and bringing them back online. I'm not sure if that sort of answered Kurt's question.
Well, I mean, I think it does in some way, because I think for me, and I'll wrap up on this point because we're on time. I think the big change for me in terms of the way that we're thinking and to think creatively in the way that we use e-commerce is to rethink about the consumer, or to think more about the consumer and their experiences, to move away from just thinking about the platform as a way to deliver convenience and a lower cost, perhaps, or a way to just have people transact on a product. But the scale that we have behind marketplaces or even brand.coms now means that the experience needs to change. And to do that, we need to think about the consumer. So on that point, thank you, Neha. It's a really good conversation. As with all e-commerce conversations, they could probably go on for another half an hour or an hour. But thank you for your time today. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And we'll be back in another couple of weeks with a different topic. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks.
Thank you.